July 7th, 1944. Dawn breaks over Saipan's blood-soaked beaches. Captain Ben Salomon sets down his scalpel and picks up a rifle. The 33-year-old Army dentist has spent the night operating on wounded soldiers in a forward aid station barely 50 yards behind American lines. Outside his medical tent, rifle fire has been steady but distant, manageable. Then, at 5 a.m., that sound changes. It becomes a roar, a tsunami of voices screaming in Japanese. The largest Banzai charge in Pacific War history, somewhere between 3,000 and 5,000 enemy soldiers, has just broken through the American perimeter and is charging directly toward his position. Salomon has 15 minutes to make a decision that will define the thin line between heroism and annihilation. The weapon that wasn't supposed to be there, an M1917 Browning machine gun, sits outside the tent, its crew already fallen. This water-cooled beast was designed to be operated by a team of 4 men weighing over 100 pounds with its tripod, water canister, and ammunition. Military doctrine said medical officers couldn't touch it. The Geneva Convention said healers couldn't become warriors. But doctrine and convention meant nothing when enemy bayonets were piercing through canvas walls and wounded soldiers were being eliminated where they lay. Ben Salomon wasn't supposed to be a warrior. Born September 1, 1914, in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, he was an Eagle Scout who attended the University of Southern California and graduated from USC Dental School in 1937. He had just started a thriving dental practice in Beverly Hills when the draft board called in 1940. The Army initially assigned him to the 102nd Infantry Regiment as a private, but his natural abilities caught attention immediately. He qualified as an expert marksman with both rifle and pistol. Within a year, he was promoted to sergeant and put in charge of a machine gun section, a dentist commanding the very weapon that would later become his final instrument of defense. In 1942, the Army commissioned Salomon as a first lieutenant in the Dental Corps. By May 1943, he was serving as the regimental dental officer for the 105th Infantry Regiment, 27th Infantry Division. On August 14, 1942, his commanding officer declared him the unit's best all-around soldier, high praise for someone whose primary job was fixing teeth. But Salomon's expertise with infantry tactics and weapons would prove more valuable than his dental skills when the 105th Infantry landed on Saipan in June 1944. Saipan represented a critical strategic objective for American forces. Capturing this island in the Marianas would give the United States direct bomber access to the Japanese home islands. The Japanese understood this perfectly. Their defense of Saipan wasn't just military strategy, it was existential warfare. By early July, the American advance had decimated Japanese forces, reducing the original 30,000-strong garrison to roughly 5,000 desperate survivors. These weren't ordinary soldiers anymore. They were warriors facing the choice between surrender and death, and their culture allowed only one option. On June 27, 1944, the 2nd Battalion's surgeon was wounded in a mortar attack. Captain Salomon, freshly promoted and with little dental work to do in active combat, immediately volunteered to replace him. He set up a forward aid station in a small tent positioned approximately 50 yards behind the forward foxhole line and about 30 yards from the shoreline near the village of Tanapag. It was close enough to treat casualties quickly, but dangerously exposed to enemy breakthroughs. On July 6th, American intelligence reported that Japanese forces were planning a major attack. The 2nd Battalion established a defensive perimeter consisting of a series of foxholes protected by artillery, preparing for what would come with the dawn. The attack that materialized at 5:00 a.m. on July 7th exceeded every nightmare scenario American commanders had imagined. General Saito Yoshitsugu, commanding the remnants of the Japanese 43rd Division, had issued a final order to his troops: advance to attack the American forces and die an honorable death. Each man would eliminate 10 Americans. Tenno Heika Banzai, long live the Emperor. Flares lit the night sky, followed immediately by determined screams and the thumping of weapons fire. Mortars rained down across American positions as an almost endless wave of enemy soldiers, a mile wide, came charging through the brush, bayonets held high, in a final desperate assault directly into the suddenly badly outnumbered 105th Infantry Regiment. Within the first minutes of the attack, approximately 30 wounded American soldiers walked, crawled, or were carried into Captain Salomon's aid station. The small tent filled rapidly with wounded men, blood soaking into the volcanic sand beneath their bodies. Salomon moved between patients with practiced efficiency, clamping bleeding arteries, setting broken bones, performing emergency surgery under conditions that would challenge even stateside hospital facilities. The sound of battle intensified outside: rifle fire, explosions, screams in both English and Japanese. As the perimeter began to be overrun, it became increasingly difficult for Salomon to work on the wounded. The tactical situation was deteriorating faster than anyone had predicted. Then Salomon looked up and saw a Japanese soldier bayoneting one of the wounded American soldiers lying near the tent. The soldier was unarmed, helpless, being eliminated as he lay bleeding on a surgical table. Firing from a squatting position, Captain Salomon grabbed an M1 rifle from a nearby table and quickly terminated the enemy soldier. One threat down, but as he turned his attention back to the wounded, 2 more Japanese soldiers appeared in the front entrance of the tent. Salomon swung the rifle like a club, striking the first soldier, then jamming the butt of the weapon into the second. He shot one and bayoneted the other before they could threaten his patience. 4 more enemy soldiers crawled under the tent walls, attempting to catch Salomon by surprise. Rushing them, Captain Salomon kicked the knife out of the hand of one, shot another, and bayoneted a third. He butted the 4th enemy soldier in the stomach, and a wounded comrade then shot and terminated the enemy soldier. 8 Japanese soldiers had penetrated his aid station within minutes. 8 were now neutralized, but Salomon understood the mathematics of the situation with brutal clarity. This wasn't a small raid. This was a massive assault, and his position was directly in its path. More would come. Many more. Realizing the gravity of the situation, Captain Salomon made a command decision that would save lives at the cost of his own. He ordered the wounded to make their way as best they could back to the regimental aid station, while he attempted to hold off the enemy until they were clear. The 30 wounded soldiers and orderlies in the tent started to retreat, some limping, some crawling, some being carried by their comrades. Salomon would buy them the time they needed. He grabbed a rifle from one of the wounded and rushed out of the tent into chaos. The M1917 Browning machine gun sat approximately 20 yards from the aid station, its original crew of 4 already fallen. This wasn't a weapon designed for solo operation. The M1917 was a crew-served, belt-fed, water-cooled heavy machine gun that had seen service since World War I. At 32 pounds without water or tripod, it required a team to transport and operate effectively. With the M2 tripod, water canister filled with cooling liquid, and a 250-round fabric ammunition belt, the total operational weight exceeded 100 pounds. The gun was 38.5 inches long, with a 24-inch barrel surrounded by a distinctive water jacket that held approximately 1 gallon of cooling liquid. This water cooling system was both the weapon's greatest strength and its most challenging feature. It allowed sustained fire that air-cooled weapons couldn't match, but required constant monitoring to prevent catastrophic overheating. The M1917A1 variant in Salomon's hands that morning had been updated with improvements over the original World War I design. It featured a cyclic rate of fire between 450 and 600 rounds per minute, fed from the left side through a canvas belt that held 250 rounds of .30-06 ammunition. Each cartridge left the barrel at approximately 2,800 feet per second, with an effective range exceeding 1,000 yards. The weapon's recoil-operated short recoil action used a sliding block locking mechanism, simpler and lighter than the toggle lock designs of contemporary European machine guns. The rear sight incorporated scales for multiple ammunition types and could be adjusted for both ground and anti-aircraft targets. Most critically, the weapon's water cooling system allowed it to fire for extended periods without the barrel failures that plagued air-cooled designs under sustained use. But the M1917's water cooling came with a deadly limitation that every machine gun crew knew intimately. The gallon of water surrounding the barrel could only absorb so much heat before it began to boil. Under sustained fire, the kind Salomon was about to deliver, the water would heat rapidly, eventually turning to steam. Once the water level dropped too low or heated beyond its cooling capacity, the barrel temperature would spike catastrophically. The steel could warp, the action could seize, rounds could cook off in the chamber. A crew normally managed this by monitoring water temperature, refilling the jacket periodically, and limiting burst lengths to prevent overheating. Salomon had no crew. No one to monitor temperature, no time to refill cooling systems. He had only the ammunition belts the previous crew had prepared and whatever fire discipline he could maintain while facing thousands of charging enemy soldiers. After 4 men had already been terminated while manning the machine gun, Captain Salomon took control of it. He positioned himself behind the weapon, gripping the spade handles, his finger finding the trigger. The first burst from the M1917 cut through the advancing Japanese with devastating effectiveness. The .30-06 rounds, traveling at nearly 2,800 feet per second, retained lethal energy across the distances separating Salomon from his targets. The psychological impact was immediate. Enemy soldiers who had been advancing confidently toward what they believed was a medical facility suddenly found themselves under sustained automatic fire from a defender who should have been bound by the Geneva Convention. Salomon's marksmanship training and his previous experience commanding a machine gun section merged perfectly with the desperate necessity of the moment. He fired in controlled bursts, conserving ammunition while maintaining effective suppression. The M1917's water cooling system allowed him to sustain fire longer than air-cooled weapons would permit, but he understood the limitations intimately. The water was heating. Steam was beginning to escape from the jacket's caps. The barrel was approaching temperatures that would compromise the weapon's function. But stopping meant death for the wounded soldiers retreating behind him, so Salomon continued firing, traversing the weapon across waves of attacking troops. The Japanese assault pressed forward with fanatical determination. These soldiers had been ordered to advance until death, and they obeyed without hesitation. They came in waves, using terrain features for cover, attempting to flank Salomon's position, firing rifles and throwing grenades. The machine gun's position became the focal point of enemy fire, dozens of rifles concentrating on the single American defender who refused to retreat. Bullets struck the tripod, sending sparks into the volcanic sand. Rounds impacted near Salomon's position, showering him with debris. But the M1917 continued firing, its distinctive rapid-fire rhythm cutting through the chaos of battle. As the water jacket heated toward boiling, Salomon faced the nightmare scenario every machine gun crew dreaded. The weapon was approaching catastrophic overheating, but enemy forces were still pressing the attack. Evidence discovered later suggested that Salomon made a tactical decision that demonstrated both his infantry expertise and his desperation. He repositioned the gun. Moving a 100-plus-pound weapon system under enemy fire, while wounded, represented a feat of physical endurance and tactical brilliance. The blood trail he left behind told the story of a man operating beyond the normal limits of human capability, driven by the knowledge that wounded soldiers behind him were counting on every second he could buy them. 4 times during the engagement, Salomon repositioned the M1917 to gain better fields of fire. Each move required lifting the weapon with its tripod, carrying it to a new location, setting it down, reorienting it toward enemy positions, and resuming fire, all while under sustained attack from Japanese forces that had recognized him as the primary obstacle to their advance. The physical toll of moving such weight, combined with wounds he was receiving, would have incapacitated most soldiers. But Salomon continued fighting, continued firing, continued repositioning. The pile of empty ammunition belts around each of his firing positions suggested he maintained disciplined fire control even as the tactical situation deteriorated. The M1917's barrel was steaming continuously now, water boiling inside the jacket, metal expanding toward failure temperatures. In normal crew-served operations, this would be the moment to swap barrels, refill the water jacket, allow the weapon to cool. Salomon had none of those options. He had only the weapon in front of him, the ammunition remaining in the belts, and his own determination to hold the position until the wounded had reached safety. The gun continued functioning despite conditions that would have caused lesser weapons to fail, a testament to John Moses Browning's engineering genius and the robust construction of American military firearms. Contact with Captain Salomon was lost for 15 hours as American forces conducted a tactical withdrawal and then slowly fought to retake the territory. The Banzai charge had achieved local penetrations of American lines, but the overall defensive position held. Reinforcements arrived. Artillery support intensified. American firepower gradually pushed back the Japanese assault, though at terrible cost. When soldiers from the 105th Infantry Regiment finally retook the area around Salomon's aid station on the afternoon of July 8th, they discovered a scene that would become legendary in Marine Corps and Army history. Captain Benjamin L. Salomon's body was found slumped over the M1917 machine gun, his hands still near the spade grips, his finger near the trigger. The weapon itself had gone silent, its barrel still warm despite the hours that had passed. Around Salomon's position lay 98 dead Japanese soldiers, their bodies piled in semicircular arcs that marked the fields of fire he had controlled during his final stand. The distribution of bodies told the tactical story. Concentrations where the enemy had attempted to close with his position, gaps where his fire had been most effective, evidence of multiple waves breaking against his defensive position. The forensic evidence painted a portrait of sustained combat beyond normal human endurance. Salomon's body bore 76 bullet and bayonet wounds. Medical analysis suggested that up to 24 of these wounds had been received while he was still alive and fighting, meaning he continued operating the machine gun while bleeding from nearly 24 injuries. The blood trail leading between 4 distinct firing positions showed where he had repositioned the heavy weapon, moving it each time to gain better angles of fire as enemy dead piled up in front of his previous locations. The level of determination required to move a 100-pound weapon system while fatally wounded defied medical understanding. The M1917 itself told part of the story. The weapon remained mechanically functional despite sustained use that should have caused catastrophic failure. The water jacket was nearly empty, the metal showing signs of extreme heat stress, but the action still cycled when examined. The ammunition belts around the position suggested Salomon had fired several thousand rounds during the engagement, a rate of consumption that would normally require a four-man crew and periodic weapon maintenance. Empty canteens near the position indicated he may have attempted to refill the cooling jacket using whatever liquid was available, maintaining the weapon's function through improvisation when standard procedures were impossible. Captain Edmund G. Love, the 27th Division historian, was part of the team that discovered Salomon's body. At the request of Brigadier General Ogden J. Ross, the assistant commander of the 27th Division, Love gathered eyewitness accounts from survivors and began preparing a recommendation for the Medal of Honor. The accounts from wounded soldiers who had escaped from Salomon's aid station were consistent. The dentist-turned-surgeon had ordered them to retreat while he provided covering fire from the machine gun. They had heard the weapon firing continuously for what seemed like an impossibly long time, its sustained bursts providing the suppressive fire that allowed them to reach safety. The tactical impact of Salomon's stand extended beyond the immediate body count. By holding a critical position during the most desperate phase of the Banzai charge, he prevented Japanese forces from exploiting a gap in American lines that could have led to the destruction of the entire 2nd Battalion. His sustained machine gun fire disrupted enemy formations, forced them to seek cover, and bought precious time for American defensive positions to stabilize. The psychological effect on Japanese attackers was significant. Soldiers advancing toward what they believed was a weakly defended medical facility instead encountered devastating automatic fire from a single defender who refused to retreat. But when Love submitted the Medal of Honor recommendation in 1944, it was rejected by Major General George W. Greiner, the commanding general of the 27th Division. The official reason was stark and based on a misinterpretation of international law. Salomon was in the medical service and wore a Red Cross brassard upon his arm. Under the rules of the Geneva Convention, to which the United States subscribes, no medical officer can bear arms against the enemy. This interpretation ignored the critical distinction in the Geneva Convention between offensive and defensive actions. Medical personnel were prohibited from participating in offensive operations, but the convention allowed, even required them, to defend their patients from direct attack. The rejection of Salomon's Medal of Honor launched a decades-long effort by advocates who understood that the denial represented a fundamental miscarriage of justice. In 1951, Captain Love resubmitted the recommendation through the Office of the Chief of Military History. It was returned without action with another procedural reason. The time limit for submitting World War II awards had passed. In 1969, Lieutenant General Hal B. Jennings, the Surgeon General of the United States Army, submitted another recommendation. In 1970, Stanley R. Resor, Secretary of the Army, recommended approval and forwarded the recommendation to the Secretary of Defense. The recommendation was returned without action again. In 1998, the effort gained new momentum when Dr. Robert West of the USC School of Dentistry, along with Army dentist Colonel John E. King, resubmitted the recommendation through Congressman Brad Sherman, with support from Major General Patrick D. Scully, the new chief of the Army Dental Corps. This time, advocates carefully documented that congressional legislation passed in 1960 had removed time restrictions on medal submissions. They also gathered extensive evidence demonstrating that Salomon's actions were defensive, protecting wounded patients from direct enemy attack, rather than offensive operations prohibited by the Geneva Convention. The medical officer controversy was systematically dismantled through careful legal analysis and historical documentation. Finally, on May 1st, 2002, President George W. Bush presented Salomon's Medal of Honor posthumously to Dr. Robert West, who received it on behalf of the USC School of Dentistry. 58 years after his final stand, the Army dentist who had wiped out 98 attacking Japanese soldiers in 15 minutes of sustained combat received the nation's highest military honor. The citation emphasized that Salomon's extraordinary heroism and devotion to duty were in keeping with the highest traditions of military service and reflected great credit upon himself, his unit, and the United States Army. The ceremony represented more than individual recognition. It acknowledged that medical personnel facing direct threats to their patients had not only the right but the duty to defend them. It corrected a legal misinterpretation that had denied recognition to a soldier whose tactical brilliance and physical courage had saved dozens of lives, and it ensured that future generations would understand that sometimes the line between healer and warrior becomes impossible to distinguish, that the same hands that had fixed teeth and performed surgery had, in 15 desperate minutes, operated a machine gun with such devastating effectiveness that an entire company of enemy troops fell before a single defender. The M1917 Browning machine gun that Salomon used that morning on Saipan represented the culmination of John Moses Browning's engineering genius. First designed in the final months of World War I, it had proven itself across 3 decades of American military service. The weapon's water cooling system, often criticized as making it too heavy and complex for mobile warfare, had allowed Salomon to maintain sustained fire that would have been impossible with air-cooled weapons. The robust construction that military planners sometimes viewed as over-engineering had prevented catastrophic failure under conditions of sustained combat that exceeded any design specifications. By 1944, military planners were already beginning to phase out the M1917 in favor of lighter, air-cooled machine guns like the M1919 and later the M60. The movement toward highly mobile warfare suggested that continuous fire from static positions, the M1917's primary strength, was becoming obsolete. But Salomon's final stand demonstrated that certain tactical situations still demanded exactly what the M1917 provided: the ability to deliver overwhelming firepower for extended periods without weapon failure. His 15 minutes behind that overheating gun had proven that water cooling systems, crew-served weapons, and heavy defensive firepower retained decisive tactical value even in an age increasingly focused on mobility and maneuver. The Battle of Saipan continued for weeks after Salomon's sacrifice. American forces eventually secured the island, but at tremendous cost. More than 3,400 Americans were killed and over 13,000 wounded during the operation. Japanese casualties exceeded 29,000 military personnel killed, with only about 900 captured. The civilian toll was devastating. Thousands of Japanese civilians, convinced by propaganda that American forces would commit atrocities, chose death over capture in mass suicides at locations like Suicide Cliff and Banzai Cliff. The strategic value of Saipan justified the terrible cost. American control of the island provided the forward airfield bases from which B-29 superfortresses would eventually launch bombing campaigns against the Japanese home islands. The Banzai charge of July 7, 1944, represented one of the largest such assaults in Pacific War history. Between 3,000 and 5,000 Japanese soldiers had participated in the desperate attack, and casualty rates exceeded 80% among defending American units. Without heroes like Captain Salomon buying time for defensive positions to stabilize, the entire American perimeter might have collapsed, resulting in a catastrophic tactical defeat. His individual stand represented a fraction of 1% of total casualties inflicted during the battle, yet the tactical impact rippled across the entire defensive line. The legacy of Ben Salomon extends beyond military tactics and Medal of Honor citations. He represents the thousands of medical personnel who have faced impossible choices in combat, trained to save lives, suddenly required to take them in defense of those under their care. His story challenges simplistic interpretations of international humanitarian law, demonstrating that the distinction between combatant and non-combatant can disappear when enemy forces directly threaten wounded soldiers. And his proficiency with the M1917, a weapon he had trained on years earlier as a machine gun section leader, proved that broad tactical training could prove more valuable than specialized roles when situations deteriorated beyond all planning. The M1917 Browning machine gun served American forces through World War II, the Korean War, and saw limited service in the early stages of the Vietnam War. Production totaled approximately 120,000 units manufactured by Remington Arms, Colt's Patent Firearms Manufacturing Company, and New England Westinghouse Company between 1917 and 1945. The weapon was distributed to Allied nations throughout the Cold War era, with many continuing to serve in developing nations' armies well into the latter half of the 20th century. Today, functioning examples command significant collector interest, with transferable, fully automatic models in correct condition bringing upwards of $25,000 on the civilian market. Ben Salomon's Medal of Honor is currently displayed at the USC Dental School, where he graduated in 1937. He remains the only dental officer to receive the Medal of Honor to date, one of only 3 Jewish American soldiers who received the medal for World War II, and one of 9 Eagle Scouts awarded the nation's highest military honor. His story has been taught in Army medical training programs, dental corps history courses, and military leadership seminars as an example of extraordinary courage under impossible circumstances. The 15 minutes that Captain Ben Salomon spent behind that overheating M1917 Browning machine gun on a volcanic beach in Saipan represent one of the most remarkable individual combat actions in American military history. A dentist who became a surgeon, then a warrior, then a legend, operating a crew-served weapon alone while fatally wounded, repositioning it 4 times under enemy fire, maintaining disciplined fire control while bleeding from 24 injuries, holding a position long enough for 30 wounded soldiers to escape certain death. The too heavy gun that military planners were phasing out had proven decisive in the hands of a man who understood both its mechanical capabilities and the tactical necessity of the moment. As American forces continue to grapple with the complex ethical and legal questions surrounding medical personnel in combat zones, Salomon's story provides both inspiration and caution. It reminds us that international humanitarian law must account for the reality of combat, where defensive actions to protect wounded soldiers cannot be equated with offensive operations. It demonstrates that broad tactical training for all personnel, even those assigned to non-combatant roles, can prove life-saving when situations deteriorate. And it honors the memory of a man who made the ultimate sacrifice, trading his own life for the lives of 30 wounded soldiers who would otherwise have been eliminated where they lay. The overheating gun that should have failed kept firing. The dentist who shouldn't have fought kept killing. The 15 minutes that should have been impossible became legendary, and 98 enemy soldiers who thought they faced a weakly defended medical facility instead encountered one American defender who understood that sometimes the only way to save lives is to take them methodically, professionally, and without mercy until the last wounded soldier has reached safety or the last round has been fired. If this story of American courage and sacrifice moved you, make sure to hit that like button and subscribe to the channel for more untold tales from World War II. These stories need to be remembered, and your support helps keep them alive.